Thanks, robot lady.
Oh, I love it. Okay, how should we start?
You can start maybe with an introduction. What podcast you guys work on, what your names are, and and get started.
Great. Okay, I will start us off, and then Hannah and I will just pass the ball back and forth.
Yep.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Marcel Cosman.
Oh, and I'm Hannah McGregor. We are I was like, oh, that's a pause. I guess it's time for me.
Yeah.
And we are the co-hosts of Witch Please, which is a fortnightly, meaning every second week podcast where we talk about the Harry Potter series from a critical perspective, let's say.
Yeah. We use Harry Potter as a sort of, well, we've been going back through the series, starting from book 1. We're currently making episodes about book 5, Order of the Phoenix. And we use the Harry Potter books as tools to introduce to our listeners and explain, different kinds of critical theories and methodologies, so like different ways of reading that we would otherwise maybe be teaching in university classrooms.
Yeah, we're both university professors, and so teaching people sort of skills for how to read closely and carefully is our day job, and the podcast is kind of both an opportunity to do that like in a more fun way, but also a chance to sort of share that with people who are not necessarily in our classrooms. And reading Harry Potter means that we can, for the most part, assume that people are at least largely familiar with what's happening in the books. And so, because lots of people know the books, we can just sort of focus on the ideas. Marcel, do you want to talk a little bit about why we decided to start Witch Please back in 2015, 6 years ago?
You know what I was just thinking about the other day, Hannah, is that we actually would have decided to make the podcast in 2014, because I think we recorded our first episode in January of 2015. So this is a project that we've been working on for a very long time.
Yeah, 7 years.
Yeah, it's outrageous. So we started working on this project when I was still working on my PhD. I was pretty early in my PhD. I think I was only in my second year, maybe my third year. And Hannah was doing a postdoc. So she had finished her PhD and was back at the University of Alberta where I was, and she was teaching and doing independent research. And I guess we thought that, I think this was before podcasts really kind of took off, like before everybody and their cousin made a podcast. And we thought that it would be really fun to reread the Harry Potter series together, because I would reread the books all the time, and Hannah had never reread them but wanted to. We thought that it would be fun to just get together with a microphone and just record our thoughts about the books. And then, just to be extra silly, we would put it on the internet as a podcast.
It was definitely before the like huge podcast boom of the last few years. And particularly before, I think, people started thinking of podcasts as necessarily like a thing that you did with the goal of making money at some point. It was much more like you just did it for fun. You just did it for fun because you wanted to have a conversation with a friend and put it online. And podcasting is great for that, because it's like, a couple of schmucks who don't really know all that much about audio production can just sit down with a single microphone and just have a conversation into that microphone and put it on the internet. And even though things have changed and there are a lot more podcasts now, that is actually still the case. Like, a couple of people with like a smartphone like voice recording app can just sit down and be like, cool, we're making a podcast.
Yeah, it's true. We weren't even the first people that we knew who were making a casual podcast. We had a friend of ours was making a How I Met Your Mother podcast that he and his friend just recorded on smartphones, and they did no editing. They just sat down and talked about each episode, recorded it, and then put it on the internet.
Yep. So we were a little more technologically sophisticated from the start because Marcel owned a single audio recorder and one microphone that plugged into that audio recorder. And so we were like, it's still the same one that she uses. I mean, we keep trying to convince her to get a better microphone, but she won't. This microphone is really just her sort of recognizable sonic signature at this point. So can't change. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, as they say.
Exactly.
So we would like sit at a table or on a couch together and hand the microphone back and forth as we talked. And
eating
that was
chips.
Eating chips in between. Like the person, when you were talking, you were supposed to not be eating chips. So when you talked, the other person ate chips. But because we were just recording on one microphone, you can still kind of hear the chips in the background.
Absolutely. It became a signature
audio.
sound.
Yeah. And it was handy to start when we were still new at podcasting, actually just to have the one microphone and to need to pass it back and forth, because it meant that we talked over each other less. We had to like actually give the other person a chance to finish their point.
It's true. Yeah. And it was also very clear that the other person wanted to talk because they would sort of be reaching for the microphone to
Trying
indicate,
to get the microphone.
Like, finish what you're saying because I want this now. Yeah. Yeah.
So that was how we recorded.
And so as a
this is why we need one microphone.
Yeah. So as a tool for early podcast development, definitely highly recommend one microphone.
One microphone. And then Marcel did all of the audio production for initially, the first 8 months of the podcast.
Something like that. Yeah.
Well, because you did it right up until you gave birth to the baby that you realized you were pregnant with, I think the day after we recorded our first episode.
It's true.
And so you did all of the early editing, and that was in part because you had, I think, a little bit of a vision, and also you had some experience. You had done some community radio.
I would say I had more experience than vision, but the vision quickly superseded the experience.
And how did you arrive? Because I feel like you came up with a really distinct sound for the podcast very quickly.
So even though we were having serious conversations about these books, I just kept thinking, at the end of the day, this is a Harry Potter podcast. We're talking about Harry Potter. So we're going to put all of the sound effects in that we possibly can, because the Harry Potter books are fun and whimsical. And so even if we're having serious conversations, every time we say the word owl, there will be an owl hoot in the background.
Every time somebody mentions the night bus, a little beep, beep,
beep, beep. There was, so a lot of the sound effects that I included were just things that I could find for free. So in the early days of the podcast, I made a lot of use of free sound archives online. Like we really didn't spend any money on this podcast at all.
No.
There are a tremendous amount of resources that are available to you. If you just Google things like free sound effects, royalty-free music, that kind of thing, and you'd be amazed at the stuff that you will come up with. And so I was able to find, there were things like scary cat sound, and I thought, great, every time we talk about Mrs. Norris or Crookshanks, that weird sound effect is coming in. Yeah, wolf howls and things. So that's largely where all of that stuff came from.
Yeah, so we made this odd podcast where we talked theoretically about the Harry Potter books, but with lots of silly sound effects and a lot of giggling because we always made each other laugh. And then we put it on the internet with kind of no idea about how you get people to listen to a podcast, and also no real particular goal. Our primary purpose was to hang out together and have fun. Yes. And it was sort of like nice side benefit. If people actually listen to it, that will be cute. But like, this is just for us.
Yeah. And that remains one of the things that people tell us. Sorry, let me be specific about what that is. The fact that we get together and we have fun, it sort of remains one of the main things that people tell us they really like about the podcast is we, no matter what the topic is, ultimately we're just, even if we're having serious conversations and even if we're introducing serious academic language and terms and tools, we're still just making each other laugh and goofing around. And people seem to really like that. They like to listen to two friends have a good time.
And it was a really, I think, good spirit to bring into making the podcast, because then we wouldn't be disappointed no matter what happened with it, because the goal was to have fun and we were having fun. So anything else was just like the icing on the cake. Like if other people listened and engaged, absolutely amazing. But we had already accomplished our goal, which was to do a fun project together. And I recommend this to new podcasters all the time. Like make it with somebody you like hanging out with and make it about a topic that it is fun for you to talk about, because it's kind of hard to control whether or not people actually listen, like unless you have like a celebrity or a massive like company backing you. It's kind of tricky. Like there's things that you can do and we can talk about them, but it's kind of tricky to actually like get people to listen because there's so many podcasts out there. So rather than like, I'm going to make a podcast and I'm going to become famous because of my podcast, being like, I'm going to make a podcast and I'm going to have a great time, because you can control that.
Totally. Maybe, I don't know, Hannah, do you think we should talk about some of the challenges that we faced before we talk about some of the things that made us successful, or the other way around?
Yeah, let's talk about challenges so we can go from hard to good.
Okay, that sounds great. So okay, so we have we have kind of two versions of the podcast. We have what we call the original run, which is when it was just me and Hannah, just with one and then eventually a second microphone. And this is when we did 100% of the work between the two of us 100% of the time. So that's the original run. We did that for several years.
2015 to 2018.
That's right. Oh my gosh. It's a long time.
Yep.
We continued making this original version of the podcast with very few breaks through like the birth of my first child. We continued to make it through Hannah's relocation out of Edmonton, where we were both living, and into Vancouver, where she then started like a real, where she is now, where she started a real grown-up job being a professor at SFU.
And was just like in my office at my like serious professor desk, spending 3 hours recording a Harry Potter podcast with Marcel.
Yeah.
And the director of my department would come by and be like, "Are you still recording?" I was like, "Yeah.
Yes,
we have a lot to say."
Work. And I was still working on my PhD, and gradually, like life just became a lot, I think, for both of us. And we kept trying to squeeze in time for this podcast, but it pretty quickly became it kind of too much to take on.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of work, particularly if you want to release something on a regular schedule. And after the first 5 or 6 episodes, we sort of started to build up an audience. And the more we built up an audience, the more the audience was looking for stuff to come out in a predictable way. And so we felt sort of committed to the idea of like a regular release schedule and a certain quality. And it kind of like Marcel got more and more demanding towards herself about production quality, the more people listened, because then it felt like, oh, this isn't just the two of us. And so it was a lot of work, and it was a commitment to doing that work on a really regular basis. And then just at a certain point, it started to feel like a job instead of like a fun thing. And because the point had been for it to be fun, we were like, okay, this is kind of becoming more work. Like the fun work teeter-totter had gone too far in the work direction. And we were like, you know what? We got to stop doing this.
Yeah, there was a little bit of time where we had talked about setting up a Patreon, which for folks who don't know, a Patreon is an online tool for creators of different kinds of content to basically get money from people who like to sponsor their work. So it would have been, we do have one now. Excuse me, so sorry. We do have one now, but at the time when we were looking into setting one up, neither of us had ever done that before. We didn't know how. It didn't seem complicated, but it seemed like it would just be more work and might not necessarily pay for it. I want to say pay for itself. A Patreon is free, but what I mean is the work that we put into making money through Patreon may not have made it worthwhile to keep doing that work. So we didn't. Just seemed like too much.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that we had run out of books. We had been rereading this series, and we, like a lot of other Harry Potter reread podcasts, go like chapter by chapter, but Witch Please started before all of those podcasts. So we didn't know the normal thing to do was to go chapter by chapter. So we just did an episode per book. And then eventually 2 episodes per book when the books got really long. And so we also ran out of content quite quickly.
It's true. We did all the movies, and we started to do things like, okay, well, let's look at trailers for the Fantastic Beasts series. Let's look at some of the fan-made stuff that people want us to talk about.
Yeah. We ran out of momentum, and it was kind of a tricky thing because we ran out of momentum, I would say, at the peak of our popularity. Like we stopped making the podcast when it was the most popular it maybe ever was. When shortly after we stopped, we hit 20,000 subscribers. People were still finding the early episodes and sort of coming back and being like, oh, I just found your podcast. And we were like, it's over. Sorry.
We did end, I think, really unceremoniously too. We didn't have like okay, this is our last episode, because we had to stop making it sort of just a whole bunch of stuff in our personal lives all kind of blew up at the same time. And so it wasn't really our intention to stop. We had tried a few different formats to keep it going. And it was in the middle of one of those different styles where life just became really complicated. And so it became an indefinite hiatus that lasted 2 years.
2 years, yeah. But along the way, we learned so much during that first run of making the podcast. And most of what we learned through doing. So we learned, for example, that it is a bad idea to record for 3 to 4 hours if your goal is to release episodes that are 1 hour long. Because if you have 3 to 4 hours of audio and you're trying to edit it down to 1 hour, that takes an enormous amount of time. If you want an hour-long episode, you should maybe record for an hour and a half.
Yeah, I think I remember in the early days when we would record for just however long we felt like it would take around 18 hours to edit a single episode. And partly that was also because I know for me, I was still learning how to edit audio. but I was also being a real perfectionist about it. And I was also being really precious about the funny jokes and exchanges that we had. And so I didn't want to like, oh, that was a really funny thing that Hannah said though. So I want to keep that. And in order to keep that, I have to keep this whole conversation, which leads to that funny thing that Hannah says.
So message 2 is that the best possible editor is somebody who is not super precious about the content. And maybe that's you, because once Marcel had her first baby, I started editing some of the episodes. And I can say for sure I was a more ruthless editor than Marcel, because Marcel is a perfectionist and a very loving, gentle, kind person. And I am just like, just get it done. Just get it. You know what? This whole conversation's annoying. Delete. Move on. Put it out. Who cares? So, you know, sometimes perfectionism is the enemy of just getting a thing done.
Often the enemy of getting a thing done.
But the other thing I think we really learned from the first run, you know, in addition to some exciting production challenges, I think we learned a lot about both building and engaging with an audience.
Totally.
Like how you actually put your work out there and encourage people to listen to it, and then what you do once people do start listening to it, which is its own set of challenges.
One of the things that we were not expecting is the diversity of listeners. Like, we thought it would just be our friends. And then suddenly it became people like in Australia.
Strangers. Just random internet strangers.
Yeah. And when you have a big audience of people who you don't know, all of a sudden, all of the sort of things that you take for granted, so things that you say that you assume people will know what you mean, that goes out the window really quickly. And so we learned to become accountable to our listeners very quickly, because people started reaching out to us and saying, hey, you made this joke and it was actually really kind of hurtful. You probably didn't mean it to be, but when you use these terms or when you say these things, it makes me feel like I don't matter, and I like your podcast and I don't like feeling bad about myself when I listen to it. And so then we on the receiving end were like, oh, holy moly, oops, wow.
Okay.
Oh,
we'll do better. We'll apologize and do better. And it is, you know, maybe a lesson that people who were like younger when they got the internet learned earlier. But that whole idea that like you put something out on the internet and you have no idea who's going to see it. And I think that at least I had anticipated that the form that unpredictable, this is Pancakes. Everybody say hi to Pancakes.
Oh, are we introducing our cats now? This is Faye.
Oh, hi, Faye.
Good kitties.
Oh, what a good
Sorry.
kitty.
As you were saying, Hannah, in the middle of making a very important point.
I had been anticipating trolling. Like my worry had been people who would come along and be like, feminism, we're furious about this. I hadn't been anticipating people who would like challenge me to think in more nuanced ways, or people who would, you know, I was kind of assuming that I was aiming my podcast to other people who had the same identity as me, and that anybody else who listened would be listening like in bad faith. Not that there would be like lots and lots of people out there really different from me listening because they wanted to engage with it, and that I would need to think about what I said and how it might impact a really unpredictable audience.
Totally. Yeah, same. I think this is something that happens to people when, I want to say that this is something that happens to people when they go to grad school. It might happen to people who don't go to grad school too. I don't know, but it happened to me when I was in grad school. And that is that I thought that I kind of knew everything. So I sort of thought that like my politics are as good as they can get. And that was not and is not true. So it was a very humbling experience to be frequently and lovingly called out by listeners who are like, hey, that was mean. Stop it.
And figuring out as the podcast went on, you know, how do we respond to, so like people go back and find the original run of the podcast all the time. New listeners are like starting at episode 1. And in like maybe episode 2 or 3, I make a really mean joke about how Harry is only eating candy and so he's going to get diabetes. And that joke is cruel, it is ableist, it is fat phobic. It's something that, you know, represents where my thinking around a lot of different sort of political questions about bodies and illness was at the time. And where my thinking's at now is really different. And a big part of how differently I think now than I did 6 years ago is how much I have learned from our listeners, how much people who I never anticipated listening to my podcast would reach out to me and be like, hey, guess what? I have diabetes. And that was a really terrible thing to say. And just like, oh, I just wasn't thinking. And so people will now start listening and get to that episode and say like, no, why would you say that? And I'm like, I don't believe that anymore, but I also don't necessarily want to go back and delete every mistake we made in the past, because I think it's important to recognize that we are all always still learning, and that we all make mistakes, and that we all learn from those mistakes and have the opportunity to like become better as a result of the mistakes we make. But that's a really tricky thing to reconcile when like a version of yourself is still there, sort of recorded on the internet for anybody to find.
And that isn't to say that we've never gone back and edited out a mistake, because I think, you know, while we're using ourselves as examples, I also during one recording made not a joke, but I made a comment that was really transphobic in its sort of essence. Like it was a sort of passing comment that in the middle of the conversation we were having, like Hannah sort of immediately corrected, and then we moved on. And so I never really thought about it until a listener contacted us and was like, you know, this is a really great example of when allies are still sort of using language and using thinking that is hurtful. And immediately, I immediately wanted to crawl into a hole and die, or like get defensive and be like, that's not what I meant. But instead, what we did is we talked about it. We decided that it was still early enough in the episode's release that it made sense to just cut it out, and we added in. So Hannah went back and edited the episode. I added in. Sorry, I know that the specifics don't really matter. But
I went back and edited it out of the episode very quickly, and then Marcel wrote a longer apology and put it at the beginning of the following episode, because it felt important to recognize in that particular moment really how we were grappling with like what we believe and our values. Which is like, we are both queer people and we both love and value trans people, and sort of the degree to which our language and thinking was not keeping up with our values, and the fact that like we really wanted to sort of own that and put that front and center. But, you know, one thing that this indicates is like the work of the show in that original run wasn't only the work of reading very long books. The books are so long, reading these very long books and recording these episodes and editing them, putting all the sound effects in, putting them up online, adding the show notes, promoting them on Twitter, engaging with people on Twitter, but then also like actually thinking about how the episodes impacted people and being accountable for like what they did once they were out in the world. And that was a lot of work to be doing for free.
I absolutely remember saying at one point that I would love to keep making the podcast, but could we refuse to engage with listeners? And that was clearly a joke, because engagement with listeners, like, I think our primary tool for maintaining listenership and expanding it. People get really excited because we actually interact with them.
Yeah.
We are not yet too big for our britches.
No, and it's even huge podcasts still engage with listeners. You know, one of the real pleasures of listening to podcasts is that feeling that we get of feeling like we know the hosts, feeling like they're our friends, feeling like they are important people in our lives, you know, like podcasts that you listen to regularly, you like carry it around in your ears and you hear the host talking into your head and they become a really regular part of your life. And I'm a huge podcast listener, and there's so many of my favorite podcast hosts that like, I don't know them and they're very famous, but in my heart of hearts, we're friends, which does help then when people who listen to my podcast come to me and are like, you don't know me, but in my heart of heart, we're friends. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. Don't worry. I feel the same way about other people. But recognizing that it's like, okay, you know, it doesn't really make sense to make a podcast and then refuse to engage with the people who listen to it.
Totally. Yeah. Especially when they are offering you constructive criticisms for how to make it better. And I don't mean like I don't like your sound effects.
When people say they don't like the sound effects, we ignore them.
Yes.
Yeah.
But when people say that the sound effects are too loud and it really stresses them out when they're listening, that we'll be like, oh, oops, okay.
We'll listen to that.
Noted.
Yeah. So all of this culminated in us having a podcast that lots of people listened to and that we didn't want to make anymore. So we put it on indefinite hiatus. And then a couple of years later, Marcelle was almost done her PhD, and, you know, her first kid had grown up enough and was going to daycare. And I had sort of settled into my job a little bit more. And I came to Marcelle and said, like, I would really like to start making Witch Please again. And Marcelle said, I will consider it on one condition. And that condition is we have to have a producer, because Marcelle did not have the time to produce the episode. And she refused to let me produce the episode. And you know, I also didn't have the time. I just didn't know.
That's why I refused.
Yeah.
It's not because Hannah was a bad producer.
No. She was like, we can't produce it. We don't have the time. We need a producer, and we will need to pay them. So we would need to figure out a way to get a producer and pay them. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. And so I went onto Twitter and said, hi, Marcelle and I would like to start making Witch Please again. But we need a producer. Any podcast networks out there want us? Do you want to just have us and then give us a producer? Does that seem like a good deal? And lo and behold, it did. To one extremely lovely network who we already knew, a network called Not Sorry, which makes Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, which is a podcast that is very different from Witch Please, but in many ways really aligned. because it is about rereading the Harry Potter books and thinking seriously about them and about what they're doing.
Yeah.
Honestly, this cat, she's just pacing.
Cats need love.
Yeah.
Don't we all? Yeah. So I really want to talk about what having a producer does, and how it can, I think, help you in making a podcast, because I think having a producer doesn't necessarily need to mean you are already a successful podcast and have joined a network. I think that if you and some friends are thinking about and wanting to make a podcast together, I think having a person in that team who is the dedicated producer can actually make a huge difference in your ability to sustain the process of making the podcast in the first place.
Yeah.
When we were first thinking about how the work was too much for us, so before we stopped making the original run, and we're sort of desperately trying to find new ways to make this podcast sustainable, we never even considered having a producer do the editing, because we both kind of thought that we were the only people who would understand what the vibe of this podcast is. Which now, looking back, is a very silly thing to think.
It's extremely silly.
We've now had 2 full-time producers, and we've also had one sort of interim producer, and all 3 of those fabulous people have totally gotten us and gotten what we're trying to do. And we're also, like, all 3 of them have also been collaborators with us. And so they would put together an edit of an episode, and then they would give it to us and say, what do you think? Give me some notes. And then we would get to do things like say, I don't know, like, please put a sound effect in here, or this joke isn't actually as funny as we think it is, so please cut it out.
It. The other thing that a producer does is that they sit in on the recording and they listen without participating in the conversation, which means they can notice places where we misspeak, places where we sort of lose track of a point, or where, we go on for too long and then need to reword what we were trying to say. And it is so helpful to have somebody just listening and saying, like, okay, that didn't quite make sense. Can you try saying that again a different way? Or could you clarify this aspect of this thing that you were just saying? Because I think it would be possible that people would misunderstand it. So like, somebody is catching a lot of the mistakes that our listeners would catch, and that we would then have to sort of like deal with later. They're catching them in the moment, and we can just be like, oh yeah, okay, let me reword that. They're also just, they're making the editing process easier for themselves by making us like stop giggling and make our point more clearly.
Rude.
But this is a model that a lot of independent podcasts use, is that they've got, the 2 friends who are the co-host and the 3rd friend who is the producer, and the 2 friends are on mic and the producer friend is listening, and they are listening for that moment where they can be like, nope, start that conversation over, or this bit has been going on for too long and we need to stop it and move on. Yeah, do this. Try that again. That's how our producer signals to us that we need to give a sentence another try. But just having somebody there just listening and like helping you get your recording a bit more streamlined, we were really nervous about it to start. We were really nervous that it would make us too self-conscious, but it was great, and a lot of podcasts do it.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how good it feels to have brought in another person, and I think in a lot of ways it's also made our recording more fun,
I think it has.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And it's a really good message or lesson for us about collaboration and about how like it can really feel like when you've got an idea and you've got a thing that you've created that like you want to maintain sole control over that because other people will misunderstand it or other people will do it wrong or other people will mess it up or water it down or whatever it is. But in my experience, most of the time when you bring other collaborators into things, they make those things better because they bring in other perspectives and other skill sets and other strengths. And the new thing that you make together is like even more exciting as a result. And I wish earlier on in my sort of career of making things, I had really wrapped my head around how much fun it is to make things with other people and how much better things are when I make them with other people who like can sort of challenge and enrich my perspectives.
I don't know about you, Hannah, but I was a person who always really disliked group work.
Yes. Oh, I hated group work in class. And now I'm the professor who makes everybody do group work.
Yeah.
Even though I hated it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's something that's like really fundamentally different about collaborating versus doing forced group work. And so like if you are also listening to this and you're like, no, I'm not doing that. I hate group work. I'm going to do it all myself. Nay. It's very different.
It is really different when you choose people. And it is going back to that thing we were saying right at the very beginning, like it is fun to do things with your friends. And a podcast can be a really fun thing to do with your friends. I think that's why a lot of podcasts are like rewatch or reread podcasts, because it's just like, okay, me and my friends are going to get together and we are going to rewatch all of Friends right from the beginning. And we're just going to record like a half-hour conversation after each episode and just put it online. And the main reason for it is going to be like, I want to hang out with my friends and I want to watch the show and I want to talk about it. And then if other people who also like Friends want to listen to our silly jokes about Friends, great, fantastic, bonus.
I've been excuse me. I've been talking a lot about the television series Only Murders in the Building recently because I've been watching it for the first time with my partner, and it is just occurring to me right now that these three characters who are making this podcast together were strangers, but then they become friends. They're making a podcast together as friends, and it's just
that's what that show is about. It's really beautiful. Yeah. So that is like always my top podcasting tip is make it with friends. And when in doubt, bring more people with more different kinds of skills in. Like maybe you've got one friend who is just like a huge music buff and their thing is just going to be finding a great theme song and some great transition music, or like writing you a cool theme song. And that's it. Like, cool. Now that's the thing I don't have to do. And then you've got a friend who's like a really great artist and it's like, cool. That friend is going to be responsible for designing the album art. Like, it's just, we don't have to know how to do everything ourselves. And we don't have to like hold on to a pure singular creative vision. We can just, do things together.
Yeah. I think that my only other tip that I really, really want to plug right now is to have segments. Because I think that segments are a really great opportunity to like keep your conversations contained, to include things like fun transition music, or like fun transition sounds or whatever. And it's a lot easier to listen to podcasts that have segments, because listening to two people have a great conversation for an hour and a half puts a lot of weight on the conversation and the like rapport between those two people. It's really hard to listen to anybody talk for an hour and a half or even an hour. But you guys are still here with us, so you know.
Well, assuming that you are still listening. Yeah, it's such a good point. A lot of those podcasts that I love, which are like casual chat podcasts, the people making them are like professional stand-up comics or professional improvisers or professional radio broadcasters who have been doing this for years and years and often like went to school to learn how to like talk to other people in an engaging way. And they make it look so easy, but it's actually really hard. And a lot of the time, the conversation that is really fun to have with your friends, just amongst yourselves, is like not necessarily all that interesting for other people to listen to. And so coming up with fun segments can be a really great way to like engage listeners a little bit more, to give your episode structure, to give it like internal variety. And there's like lots of different kinds of segments you can do. Like you can come up with games. You can come like there's lots of sort of fun. We should have games on Which Please. There's lots of different kinds of segments, and one of the like most fun kinds of segments is one that invites listeners to participate. So like lots of really popular podcasts have listeners can write in with questions, or listeners can leave like voice memos that you can play, or like it lets listeners sort of participate and even have the chance to like have their voice on the show. And that, you know, again, when you start, it might just be your 3 friends. Great, fantastic, fun. More friends is better. But it's also a really great way to engage listeners, is like offer them the opportunity to maybe also participate.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I have any other like hot tips.
Hot podcast tips. Okay,
have cats. Sorry, that's a joke.
I'm gonna end just with one reminder, which has probably already come up multiple times from other speakers, but I think is always really useful for people to remember, which is that podcasting is a medium that literally anybody can try their hand at. There is nobody curating what goes onto Apple Podcasts. There's nobody like checking if, you know, what you made is good enough. You can just put it out there. And that means that there are a lot of podcasts out there. There are millions and millions of podcasts out there. And so people started making a lot of jokes about how like, oh, everybody and their dog has a podcast. So everybody in the entire world has a podcast. And yet, if we look at the demographics of who has podcasts, it is still disproportionately white men. Like significantly and disproportionately white men, which means that actually there is still a lot of voices and a lot of stories and a lot of perspectives that don't exist out there. And a lot of the time when people start saying, oh, you know, this thing has reached saturation, or this thing, there's too much of this thing, what they mean is that the people who aren't white men are starting to make this thing and we don't like it. And so I always really recommend that folks who aren't straight cis white men ignore that idea that there's too many podcasts or that everybody has a podcast, because like actually there's still a lot of voices and stories and perspectives that are not being fully or meaningfully represented. And like chances are you have a unique perspective, a unique idea, a unique story that like somebody out there really wants to hear.
Yeah. I can't believe I forgot about that. That was, I think, maybe one of the big things that people said to us initially. Like Hannah said, we sort of anticipated trolling because we had a feminist Harry Potter podcast. And then it turned out that there were like a lot of people who really wanted to talk about Harry Potter and feminism or talk about Harry Potter in feminist ways. And so like you might worry that you don't have anything to offer, but there's no way that that is true.
There's just no way. There's just no way it's true. Like you've got your own thing to say, and and somebody out there doesn't even know yet that they are hungry for it. Yeah. Oh, amazing. All right. Well,
okay.
The end. That's it. That's the Witch Please Take on podcasting.
Amazing. I think that last like mic drop line is the perfect place to close up.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.
And little robot lady will tell us.
She never tells me when you stop.